The night was heavy in Ouagadougou. The air carried whispers, rumors of an offer from Washington that could change everything. But inside the presidential compound, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in silence, his hands resting on a plain wooden table, a single document before him. A contract, a proposal they called it, but he saw it for what it was, a chain wrapped in gold. A delegation from the United States had arrived days earlier, polished suits, cold smiles. The same tone the West had used for decades, polite but heavy with control. They spoke of partnerships, security cooperation, and shared goals. But Traoré had heard it all before. He leaned back, eyes unblinking, as the American envoy said softly, "Captain, the U.S. is ready to invest heavily in Burkina Faso's defense. Training, weapons, logistics, all free of cost. In return, we only ask for a single base. A small one, just to support operations in the region." Silence filled the room, and in that silence, history seemed to repeat itself like an old wound reopening. Traoré stood up slowly. His boots echoed on the marble floor. He walked toward the large map pinned on the wall. The map of Africa drawn in colonial ink, borders carved by hands that never lived here. He said quietly, "They said the same to Ghana, to Libya, to Niger, to Mali. They called it support, but it became surveillance. They called it security, but it became control." He turned around. His voice rose calm yet firm. "We will not become another playground for foreign powers. Africa is not a chessboard, and Burkina Faso is not a pawn." The envoy shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, you misunderstand. This is about mutual benefit. You face terrorist threats, we can help." "Help," Traoré interrupted, his eyes locked on the man. "You funded those threats for years. You built the chaos, then offered the cure. We've read your playbook. We're done playing your game." The room went silent again. The message was clear. Outside the palace walls, the city of Ouagadougou pulsed with life. Street vendors, students, soldiers, everyone knew something was happening. Rumors spread through the market stalls. They offered him millions. They want to build a U.S. base here. He refused them. By sunset, every radio in the city was tuned to one question. Would Traoré give in? Or would he defy the might of America? That night he gathered his closest advisors. Maps, intelligence reports, and intercepted communications were spread across the table. He pointed at one line of a secret memo, the kind that never makes it to the news. It read, "Objective, establish long-term presence in the Sahel to counter Sino-Russian influence." He looked up and said, "So that's the truth. Not about fighting terrorism, not about peace. It's about controlling Africa before Africa controls itself." His generals nodded. No one spoke for a long time. Days later, he called a national address. The whole country stopped. Children sat beside their parents. Soldiers lined up in their barracks. And as the national flag waved behind him, Traoré's deep voice filled the airwaves. "Brothers and sisters of Burkina Faso," he began. "They came to us again with their gifts, their weapons, their promises, their dollars. They came smiling, but behind their smiles they hide shackles." He paused. The hall was silent. "I was told to sign, to accept their base, to let them protect us. But I ask you, who protected Libya when it stood tall? Who protected Congo when it wanted its own gold? Who protected Africa when it refused to kneel?" He looked directly into the camera. "They want a playground, but we will not let Africa become their playground again. We will build our own defense, our own pride, our own destiny." The crowd outside erupted in cheers. Some cried, others shouted his name. It wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration of spiritual independence. Across the ocean in Washington, the mood turned cold. Reports from the Sahel briefings began with one alarming phrase: "Traoré has rejected our offer." The U.S. Defense Department held an emergency meeting. Analysts debated whether it was an act of hostility or a populist stunt. But one senior official said something that stunned the room. "He's not playing politics. He's starting a movement." Because Traoré's decision wasn't just about one base. It was about dismantling decades of quiet control. And while the world debated, something remarkable began happening on the ground. Young Burkina engineers volunteered to repair old Soviet-era equipment. Farmers began donating part of their harvest to feed the army. University students designed drones using scrap parts and local tech. The message spread like wildfire. If the world won't protect us, we'll protect ourselves. For the first time, Burkina Faso's flag felt heavier, not from fabric, but from pride. The West didn't understand it yet, but Traoré had just triggered a domino effect. In Mali, young officers started questioning their military partnerships. In Niger, citizens protested against new U.S. outposts. In Ghana, opposition leaders demanded an audit of all foreign bases. A new consciousness was rising, a continental awakening, and it all began with one word: no. But the Americans didn't leave quietly. What followed next would expose the hidden tactics, secret backchannels, and silent wars fought not with bombs, but with bribes. Because when Traoré said no, the empire whispered back, "We'll make you say yes." And that's when the real battle began. In the weeks following Traoré's refusal, Burkina Faso entered what many in Washington quietly labeled a containment phase. No sanctions were announced publicly. No official condemnation appeared on the news. But in the shadows, in encrypted briefings and late-night phone calls, the machinery of pressure began to turn. First came the diplomats. They arrived in neighboring countries, whispering warnings. Burkina Faso is isolating itself, they said. Its leader is jeopardizing regional stability. Then came the international media headlines, perfectly timed and perfectly worded. Burkina Faso's military leader rejects partnership offers. Experts fear rising authoritarianism in the Sahel. It was the same playbook used across decades: character assassination, wrapped in journalistic language. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré watched the headlines scroll across the screen. He didn't flinch. He turned to his communications minister and said quietly, "When they cannot control the story, they try to control the storyteller. We will tell our own story." Within hours, the government launched its own media broadcast, La Voix du Peuple, the voice of the people. It was raw, passionate, and defiant. Instead of polished anchors, it featured soldiers, teachers, and mothers speaking directly to the camera. "We stand with our president. Burkina will never bow again." The response shocked Western analysts. This wasn't propaganda, it was pride. The narrative war had begun. But Washington didn't stop there. When words failed, they turned to wallets. A US-backed NGO suddenly froze its development projects in the north. An international bank quietly delayed a $200 million disbursement, citing risk assessments. Even a few local politicians, long on the payroll of foreign consultancies, began to whisper that Traoré is going too far. It was a silent siege, an invisible war without soldiers. Yet Traoré had anticipated it. He summoned his economic team late one night. The lights in the chamber were dim. Maps of gold reserves, lithium deposits, and agricultural zones spread across the table. He said, "If they block our aid, we will create our own. The soil of Africa is richer than any foreign wallet. We just forgot how to believe in it." The finance minister asked, cautiously, "Do we have enough reserves, Captain?" Traoré smiled faintly. "We don't need reserves. We have people. That's our real wealth." Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Burkinabe youth launched Project Independence, a grassroots movement to fund small infrastructure projects through local crowdfunding. Farmers, traders, and even students began donating coins and grain. The slogan painted across walls in red and gold read, "If we build it ourselves, they can't take it away." Within 3 months, entire villages had repaired broken wells, clinics, and schools, without a single dollar from the IMF. Western intelligence reports began to read differently. Population morale high, support for leadership stable, attempts to pressure regime ineffective. Meanwhile, in Washington, a closed-door meeting at the Pentagon was underway. A senior defense analyst tapped the table and said, "He's rallying not just his people but the region. We're seeing similar rhetoric spreading across the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Chad." Another official leaned forward. "So what's the plan?" "Sanctions. Sanctions make martyrs," came the reply. "We need influence, quiet influence." And so began Operation Reconnect, a covert effort to rebuild ties through unofficial channels. NGOs, intelligence liaisons, and media collaborators. The goal wasn't open confrontation. It was infiltration, to reinsert control through the back door. Traoré's intelligence service, however, was ready. Through intercepted emails and phone logs, they discovered that several international consultants were secretly coordinating with local figures to sow unrest, distributing money, rumors, and fear. At dawn, a series of raids took place in Ouagadougou. 8 individuals were arrested, among them 3 foreign nationals posing as humanitarian coordinators. Laptops, encrypted phones, and cash-filled envelopes were seized. The evidence was overwhelming. Plans to destabilize the government from within, using protests and false stories. Traoré addressed the nation the next evening. Standing before the flag, he spoke calmly, his tone measured but burning with conviction. Brothers and sisters, the empire does not sleep. They send their soldiers wearing suits. Their weapons are words, their bombs are bribes. But we have seen their games. We will not be divided. We will not be deceived. He raised a single finger. Africa must choose, submission or sovereignty. I have chosen sovereignty. The speech went viral across the continent. In Bamako, crowds cheered. In Niamey, youth groups printed his words on banners. Even in distant Kinshasa, people began shouting his name during rallies. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about Africa's awakening. But every awakening invites danger. Late one night, Traoré's chief security officer entered his office with grim news. We've intercepted chatter from foreign sources. They're moving intelligence assets into the region. Satellite surveillance, drones, psychological ops. Traoré nodded. Let them watch. They'll see something they've never seen before, an African nation standing without permission. He looked out the window at the city lights, humble but proud, and in that moment, you could almost feel the weight of centuries lifting from the soil. But as the pressure mounted and the West's patience thinned, Washington decided to send one final message, not through threats, but through temptation. A new offer, a bigger one, and this time, it came wrapped in promises of progress and partnership. What happened next would test not only Traoré's resolve, but the entire idea of African independence itself. Because sometimes, the most dangerous chains are the ones that look like freedom. Weeks after the arrests in Ouagadougou, silence seemed to settle over the capital. The markets were open, schools were running, and the people were adapting to a new rhythm of independence. But beneath that calm, another game was unfolding, one far subtler and more dangerous than open confrontation. From Washington came whispers of re-engagement. They called it a gesture of goodwill, a bridge between nations. The official memo, later leaked, was titled, Strategic Partnership, Initiative for African Stability. It promised $850 million in infrastructure funding, energy projects, and regional peace training. The catch? All operations would be jointly managed by U.S. advisors stationed inside Burkina Faso. In plain words, a military base disguised as aid. When the document reached Traoré's desk, he read it in silence. His advisors watched, tense and expectant. Finally, he placed it down and said quietly, "They've changed the costume, but it's the same actor." One general asked, "Captain, should we reject it outright?" Traoré shook his head. "No, we'll study it carefully. Let them believe we are considering it. The hunter must first make the lion comfortable before setting the trap." Over the next few weeks, diplomatic envoys flooded Ouagadougou. They smiled in press conferences, praised Burkina's progress, and promised a new era of cooperation. Behind closed doors, however, the tone was different. One senior envoy reportedly said, "Captain, the West wants partnership, not rivalry. But partnership requires alignment, military, economic, and political. That's how progress works." Traoré leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. "If alignment means submission, then Africa will remain a slave forever." The envoy tried to smile. "You misunderstand. This is business, purely business." "Then why?" Traoré asked. "Do your contracts always end with our minerals leaving our lands?" The room fell silent. Outside, on the streets of Ouagadougou, the people had already sensed what was coming. Murals began appearing overnight. Hand-painted portraits of Traoré with the words, "Africa is not for sale." Mothers carried the slogan in marketplaces. Youth groups chanted it at football matches, and schoolchildren drew it on classroom walls. Burkina Faso was speaking with one voice. The West expected a single man to bend. Instead, an entire nation stood up. When Washington saw that the charm offensive had failed, the language changed. Letters turned to warnings. Warnings turned to veiled threats. Aid would be reassessed. Security cooperation suspended. Trade routes reviewed. In the global economy's invisible architecture, this meant isolation, financial strangulation, without a single bullet fired. But Traoré had been preparing for that moment since his first day in power. He called an emergency council and declared what he named Project Sovereignty. Its pillars were simple but revolutionary. Launch an African trade alliance with Mali, Niger, and Guinea to replace Western supply chains. Transition all major mining operations to national ownership. Develop a new currency, independent from the CFA franc. The ministers looked stunned. One asked, "Captain, this will anger every foreign investor." Traoré nodded. Then they were never investors. They were owners. We are taking back what was ours. The first phase began immediately. Burkina Faso's state engineers entered mining fields previously controlled by French and American companies. Flags were replaced overnight. Foreign logos taken down, replaced by the national emblem. Local miners cheered, waving torches in the dark. International media called it reckless. But in the Sahel, it was called revolution. Meanwhile, a secret meeting took place at a private residence in Accra. There, diplomats from France, the US, and the EU met with regional representatives to discuss the growing threat of anti-Western populism. Declassified sources later revealed that they discussed sanction, regional isolation, and intelligence sharing. Their biggest concern: if Traoré succeeds, he will become a symbol. Symbols are harder to kill than men. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré gave a rare national address. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice echoing through the broadcast, "they will try to break us not with bombs but with hunger, not with armies but with lies. But remember this, the child who learns to walk barefoot fears no thorns." He paused, then smiled faintly. "We are that child. We will not beg to stand." Crowds poured into the streets, waving flags and chanting his name. For the first time in generations, people believed that independence was not a holiday. It was a responsibility. But the West wasn't finished. A week later, a sudden drop in global gold prices wiped millions from Burkina Faso's export value. Coincidence? Unlikely. Analysts called it market correction. Traoré called it what it was: economic warfare. He responded by ordering that all gold exports be temporarily halted and stored within the national vault. Burkina Faso would trade directly with nations willing to use resources, not politics, as currency. That decision sent shockwaves through financial networks. For the first time, an African nation had turned its back not just on Western aid, but on the very system that controlled its wealth. At the UN, representatives from Western countries accused Burkina Faso of destabilizing international trade. Traoré's ambassador replied calmly, "We are not destabilizing trade. We are destabilizing exploitation." His words trended across social media within hours. In Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, the message spread: Africa is watching. But while the world applauded, dark forces regrouped behind closed doors. The battle was no longer just political. It was ideological. Because if one small, landlocked nation could defy the world and survive, others might start to believe they could too. And that, to the West, was the greatest threat of all. The air in Ouagadougou was thick with tension. The world's most powerful nations had turned their gaze on a landlocked country that had dared to say no. Sanctions were being drafted. Media outlets ran endless stories labeling Traoré a populist dictator, a rebel captain drunk with power. But inside the presidential office, there was calm. Traoré stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker beneath the night sky. A young aide entered with breaking news. The United States had officially announced the withdrawal of all non-essential personnel from its embassy. The message was clear. Burkina Faso was being cut off. He didn't flinch, he just whispered, "They think isolation will break us. But a people who have known abandonment their whole lives cannot be scared by loneliness." The backlash begins. The next morning, headlines across Western media read, "Burkina Faso in crisis after U.S. withdrawal. Economic meltdown expected as West pulls aid." But inside Burkina Faso, a very different story was unfolding. Farmers were harvesting record yields, After months of state-backed agricultural programs, small industries that had long been overshadowed by foreign corporations were now thriving under national ownership. For the first time in decades, the nation's gold revenues weren't vanishing into foreign bank accounts. They were funding schools, clinics, and solar grids. Still, the pressure was immense. The central bank reserves were depleting, energy prices were surging, and foreign investment had all but vanished. Some members of the cabinet began to panic. One minister said, "Captain, the people are strong, but hunger tests even the strongest." Traore turned to him and said, "Yes, hunger tests the strong, but slavery destroys them." He walked to the national map hung on the wall. "If we must rebuild, we'll rebuild brick by brick, but not with foreign chains around our wrists." The secret message. Days later, a secret diplomatic cable arrived from Washington. It was worded politely, but carried a threat between the lines. Burkina Faso has the opportunity to restore normal relations. The U.S. is willing to reconsider its stance, provided that the current government reopens cooperation on military security and development strategy. Translation: accept our presence or suffer the consequences. Traore's response was just 2 sentences long. Burkina Faso will not sell its soul for rice and fuel. We are not for rent. He sealed the letter with the national emblem and sent it through official channels. Then he gave an impromptu speech to the press. Traore addressing the nation. "Brothers and sisters of Africa, today I tell you this. They will call us rebels because we refuse to be servants. They will call us poor because we no longer beg, but I would rather walk hungry with dignity than eat with chains on my neck. Let the world see that Africa is not their playground. We are not the story they write. We are the authors of our own destiny." The shockwave. His speech exploded across the internet. Within hours, hashtags like "Africa is awake" and "We stand with Burkina" began trending in over 15 African countries. In Mali and Niger, crowds flooded the streets waving Burkina Faso's flag. In Ghana and Nigeria, students held rallies shouting, "If Traore can stand up, so can we." Washington and Paris were stunned. The narrative they had tried to shape of Traore as an unstable populist was backfiring. He was becoming a symbol, the face of a continent rediscovering its pride. One Western diplomat reportedly told Reuters, "We underestimated him. We thought he was just another soldier. He's becoming a movement." The economic counterattack. With foreign funding gone, Burkina Faso turned inward. Traore signed a decree launching the National Gold Reserve Program. Every ounce of gold mined in the country was now owned by the people, not corporations. Within 6 months, the National Reserve hit $3.8 billion in stored value. That gold was used to back a new financial system between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, bypassing Western banking entirely. The IMF called it illegal. Traore called it freedom. When a journalist asked if he feared sanctions, he replied, "A slave who fears his master's whip will never know what it means to be free. Sanction us, but remember, hunger makes lions, not sheep." Washington silence. Behind closed doors, intelligence briefings in Washington painted a troubling picture. Satellite imagery showed new trade routes forming between Sahel nations and Asian partners. Russian and Chinese envoys were visiting frequently. Burkina Faso's state-owned energy plants were expanding. And perhaps most unsettling, U.S. influence in West Africa was fading fast. In a private meeting, one senator reportedly said, "If this man succeeds, Africa will never look at us the same way again." But it was already too late. The people's victory. By the end of the year, Burkina Faso had survived without a single Western loan. No famine, no civil collapse. Instead, schools were opening, local businesses were rising, and new alliances were taking shape across Africa. Traore stood before a massive crowd on Independence Day. The red, green, and gold flags waved across the horizon. He raised his hand and said, "They said we would fall. They said we could not survive without them. But look around. This soil feeds us. This sun powers us. This spirit sustains us. Africa is no longer begging for a seat at the table. We're building our own table." The crowd roared, the drums thundered, and fireworks lit the night sky. That night, as the celebrations echoed through the streets, one truth became clear. The day Burkina Faso rejected the U.S. military offer, It did more than make a political decision. It changed the course of African history, because for the first time in decades, a leader had stood before the world's strongest powers and said the three words they feared most. We don't need you. If you're still watching, you already know history is being written in Africa, and stories like this are only the beginning. So if you want to witness what comes next, hit that subscribe button and join the awakening.